Lunav approached Cyan, started looking him straight in the eyes and asked if he was Cyan Vert. Cyan, who was sitting at the table and eating quietly, remained silent in thought. Seeing that he wasn't responding, with a serious look, she began to smile. Despite being somewhat confused, he decided to stay calm. Then, he turned his head towards her and with a serious look began to wonder how she knew his name. He answered her yes and also asked her who she was. Lunav began to sit in the chair next to Cyan. She closed her eyes and with a smile asked him if he minded if she sat next to him. Cyan, who had one hand resting on the table, with a calm look told her that she still hadn't answered his question. She opened her eyes, started looking at him with a cheerful look and with a smile introduced herself as Lunav. She went to the same academy as him and was a second-year student there. To him, the name Lunav sounded very familiar. He turned his head towards her, started staring at her intently with a confused look and couldn't help but wonder why she was acting so friendly. He responded to her that he didn't know this and also added that he wasn't interested in students who weren't in the same year as him. She closed her eyes and with a pleasant smile explained to him that she was a stranger compared to someone as popular as him. Cyan crossed his arms and couldn't help but feel somewhat confused since he didn't know that he was so popular at the academy. Brian and Nana, who were sitting in front of them, simply remained silent. Nana approached Brian. She started to look at Lunav and asked him if she was a friend of Cyan, while a drop of sweat was falling from his cheek. With a confused look he explained to her that he had no idea. According to him, they didn't seem like friends. Lunav started to look towards them and told Cyan that the Guardian Knight and his maid seemed to be quite close. She was also somewhat surprised to see that they were also eating together with Cyan. Brian, who had a hand resting on the table, and Nana, who was sitting next to him, were somewhat surprised. She brought her hand closer to her face and with an insinuating look thought that he was a rather warm person, unlike the rumors, while a drop of sweat was falling from his cheek. With a serious look he told her that there was no need for them to eat separately. Cyan started staring at her and couldn't help but go on alert since it was very suspicious that she was praising him out of nowhere. He didn't know what her reason was for approaching him anyway. Lunav put one hand under her chin, started looking at Cyan and with a smile asked him if he had come to the capital to attend the banquet. Cyan began to look at the ground, responded with a yes and also asked her how she knew this. She started to approach him and asked what other reason could a person like him have for coming to the capital if he never left the academy. While she had her hand under his chin, she began to look at Brian with a calm gaze and explained to him that this was very well. She decided to meet him at the banquet since she had also been invited. With a calm look, Cyan stayed listening in silence. He began to stare at her and started wondering if she had also received that letter. It didn't take him long to conclude that she was also a noble. The tension in the atmosphere began to heat up. Seeing this, Lunav placed both hands on the table and started to stand up, deciding to leave today's conversation at just introductions. For her, it was a pity since she had to go. Before leaving, she asked Cyan not to forget about her. At the entrance of the restaurant, there were several hooded men standing and watching the area. Lunav stood up, and as she was walking away, her body began to emit a powerful and intense mana. She slightly turned her head back, and with a smile revealed to Cyan that her full name was Lunav Rainreaver. Upon hearing her full name, Cyan's expression changed drastically. He couldn't help but be surprised. With a shocked look, he remembered everything about Lunav Rainreaver. He remembered that she was the granddaughter of the president of the Garam Magicians Association named Raijin's Rainreaver. He did not know if that old man had sent her here. In his past life, she had died young while attending the academy, although he was not sure if this had happened due to her fragility, or because the association had conducted intense inhuman experiments on her. While a drop of sweat was falling from Cyan's cheek, he put his hand under his chin, started looking at Lunav with a confused look and couldn't help but feel very annoyed since he kept getting involved with people he hadn't even related to in his past life. Thinking about this, it didn't take him long to realize that this meant the future could change even more. He began to remember a large castle under the light of the red moon. He didn't know why all this had to happen on the day of the banquet. This banquet was going to be called Banquet of Blood. At the same time, in a room somewhere in the realm, a woman with white hair wearing an elegant dress brought both hands to her head and started fixing her hair. This person was none other than Princess Erin. She brought her hand to her chest, slightly turned her head back, and while she was starting to blush, with a shy look she asked Leximus if she looked good wearing this dress. Leximus, who was standing behind her, gave her a thumbs up and with a smile praised her by explaining that she looked super pretty. According to her, she looked better than ever. But unfortunately for Leximus, Princess Erin paid no attention to her. She took off the dress she was wearing and threw it on the bed along with the other dresses because it didn't convince her. Leximus, who was standing behind her giving thumbs up, started crying when she saw that this dress also didn't convince her. The reality was that she had already tried on a lot of outfits. All she wanted was to leave here. Princess Erin grabbed another dress with both hands, turned around, started to see how the dress looked on her, and after several seconds told Leximus that this dress didn't look good on her either. Upon hearing this, Leximus began to look at her with a confused expression and couldn't help but feel somewhat disappointed. She crossed her arms, closed her eyes, and asked her not to worry because she was sure Cyan would like looking at her. Princess Erin, who was holding a skirt and standing in front of the mirror, began to blush like a tomato thinking about Cyan. While she was red as a tomato, she turned back and with a surprised look asked Leximus if Cyan was also going to attend the banquet. Leximus turned around, sighed, and with a confused look explained to her that she had been the one who sent him the invitation. After saying this, she asked her to stop playing dumb. Upon hearing this, Princess Erin got angry. She clenched both fists tightly and tried to come up with an excuse, but just before she could say a word, Leximus, who was in front of her, put one hand on her waist and extended the other towards her, indicating for her to stop. She asked her to stop since it was very obvious to her. A maid who was holding a box with clothes approached her and caught her attention. She opened the box, and while holding it with both hands, she closed her eyes and with a pleasant smile explained that Highness Lionel had sent her a gift, saying that this might suit her well. Erin started to look at the box with a confused look and couldn't help but start sweating and remain in shock upon seeing that her brother had sent her a gift. The box contained a beautiful necklace which had valuable and shiny diamonds. Leximus approached the box. She clasped her hands together, closed her eyes, and with a smile told her that this necklace was very pretty. She was sure Cyan would like how it looked on her. Erin, who was red as a tomato, began to get angry and with a furious look asked her to stop talking, since she did not like this necklace. After a few hours, everyone went to the palace where the banquet was going to be held, which was a very luxurious place. This place was full of important people who were enjoying a glass of wine. At this banquet there were also guards. A blonde-haired man, who had one hand resting on his sword, began to look to one side. A blonde-haired woman who had both hands resting on her abdomen started looking at the man and remained silent. Not far away was Cyan. While he had his back against the wall, he put his hands in his pants pockets and with a serious look began to look around. Despite there being many people, he could not see the target. He turned his head to one side and began to closely observe the surroundings. Next to him was a hallway, and in this hallway was Kellen, who also had his back against the wall. Cyan didn't take long to sense Kellen's presence. While people were conversing among themselves, he started whispering and upon seeing that he was here, realized that Ashel must also be present at the grand banquet. Kellen approached the corner and with a serious look responded to him that yes, Ashel had come to the banquet and was now next to Prince Lionel. He also added that there was something he needed to tell him. Cyan started staring intently at Kellen and asked what it was he wanted to tell him. In response, Kellen asked him if it was possible for him to leave this banquet. He didn't know if information about the purification mission had leaked out. With a serious look, he asked Kellen if something had happened. With a lost look, Kellen began to stare at the ground and explained that he had a bad feeling. He believed that many people, including Cyan, could be in danger. Ashel had ordered him to leave the palace before the banquet started because he had prepared a small event. Upon hearing this, Cyan's expression changed drastically. He couldn't help but stay in shock and go on alert at the same time. With a confused look, he began to wonder what was happening and what Ashel's bastard was planning to do. He started imagining Ashel smiling. With a surprised look, he began to wonder if it could be that the person behind the blood banquet was Ashel. Kellen approached a little, started looking at the ground with a lost gaze, and explained to Cyan that he couldn't bear to see him hurt, so for this reason he was asking him to leave the banquet. Cyan remained calm and asked Kellen to withdraw. In response, he turned his head towards him and with a serious look asked if he was going to be okay. Cyan asked him not to worry as Kellen could be in greater danger. After saying this, he again asked him to withdraw. Kellen complied, moved away from the wall, turned his back on him and while walking away, asked him to be careful. Cyan simply started looking at the ground and remained silent. Once Kellen left, little by little Cyan began to smile at the thought of the little event that was going to happen. He couldn't help but start smiling. While his eyes were shining, he thought that Ashel was crazier than he had expected. At that moment, Karam manifested herself. She started looking at Cyan and with a malicious smile asked him if he was worried about innocent people dying. Cyan, who had his back against the wall, put both hands into his pants pockets, closed his eyes, and with a smile responded to her that no, he had only thought he was being tender. He opened his eyes, started looking to one side with a calm gaze, and thought that the most important thing now was that he would have to postpone the mission. After thinking this, he began to use the technique called psychological influence. At the banquet, Sarika was also present. She wore a very elegant dress. Cyan's psychological influence began to spread throughout the hall. With a serious look, she started looking in Cyan's direction. This technique allowed the members of Mist to communicate with each other using psychic powers. Cyan praised her, saying that the dress she was wearing suited her very well. In response, she asked him what this was. Sarika was standing in front of Cyan, who had his back against the wall. He explained to her that they were going to have to postpone the purification mission. To avoid drawing attention and not seem suspicious, Sarika grabbed a glass of wine and with a serious look asked him why they were going to have to postpone the mission. He revealed to her that he had just received information that this banquet hall would soon turn into an ocean of blood. Upon hearing this, her expression changed drastically. She couldn't help but be in shock and start trembling with fear, while a drop of sweat was falling from her cheek. With a surprised look, she asked him if this was true. Cyan opened his eyes and with a serious look explained to her that there was no time for explanations. Now they had to check first if there were no monsters nearby. Sarika clenched her teeth tightly and with an uncertain look asked him if he was sure the information was reliable. While Cyan's eyes were shining, with a confident smile he explained to her that he knew very well the person who could be behind all this. He had the feeling that this could happen, but now they had just hit him on the head. Cyan started looking at Sarika and with a smile asked her not to worry since her perverted fiancé was also going to die in it. After saying this, he asked her if these weren't good news. Upon hearing this, she couldn't help but start blushing. With a confused look, she asked him how he knew that he was her fiancé. Cyan turned his back to her, and as he was walking away, he told her that anyway he had to go to work. Sarika began to look at Cyan with an angry gaze, clenched her teeth tightly and couldn't help but get furious and start sweating. Several seconds later, once Cyan had moved far enough away from her, she decided to calm down a bit, and with a serious look told him that it would be better if he explained himself later. At the banquet, Alice was also present. She was standing behind Sarika. Seeing that the instructor had also come, she couldn't help but be left open-mouthed. While a drop of sweat was falling from her cheek, she began to turn her head back and upon recognizing her voice, she couldn't help but be in shock. When she turned around, she saw Alice, who was wearing a very elegant dress. She grabbed the skirt with both hands, and as she was approaching, she began to smile, and with a joyful look told her that it had been a long time since they had seen each other. Sarika approached her, and with a confused look asked what she was doing here. Alice placed her hands on her abdomen, closed her eyes, and with a smile told her that she had only come to get some fresh air since after all it was also her duty. Sarika started looking at Alice with a gaze full of fear, and couldn't help but panic at the thought that she too would be dragged into the incident. She remained absorbed in her thoughts. Alice called her attention by asking if she was okay. A man wearing a blue dress appeared. He began to advance towards them, extended a hand to one side, and upon seeing that Alice had also come, he thought it was as if he were looking at two flowers. They simply stayed silent. Alice closed her eyes and started to show a forced smile. Sarika began to look back, clenched her teeth tightly, got angry and thought she was in trouble. She was already very busy and now he had appeared. This man was the target of the mission. He approached them, put his hand over his chest, bowed his head before them as a sign of respect, closed his eyes and introduced himself as Drenny's Nephiles. Several seconds later, he raised his head and began to show them a lunatic look and smile. At the same time, someone wearing boots and a black suit started walking down the palace hallway. This person was Cyan. He went through a door and ran into Brian. He turned his head towards him and with a calm voice explained that now he was going to assign him something. Brian, who was standing next to him, responded with a "Yes, young master." He put one hand behind his back, placed the other on his chest, and with a serious look explained to him that the night Brian Kendrick would fulfill any mission. Seeing his behavior, Cyan couldn't help but feel somewhat confused and embarrassed. He asked him not to do this as it was really uncomfortable for him. While a drop of sweat was falling from his cheek, he began to look at Brian with a confused gaze and thought that this guy had been getting too confident lately. Brian, who had his fist on his chest, remained silent. In his imagination, his body was surrounded by powerful flames. According to him, he was very strong. Cyan didn't know if this was because Brian felt more like an appropriate guardian knight after eating that dragon, Cyan, who had one hand resting on his waist, approached Brian, extended the other hand towards him and ordered him to go inspect the underground paths of the palace. Brian got nervous and started to sweat because for him that place was dark and it scared him a lot. Cyan began to lose his composure. He started pointing at him with his finger, clenched his teeth tightly, and with a furious look ordered him to leave since he had his own reasons for assigning this mission to him. With a surprised look, Brian called out to him and asked him to look behind. Cyan was somewhat confused and asked what he was talking about. Brian replied that a suspicious person was taking a look at him from behind. Behind him, there was a room. A woman put her hands on the corner and started staring intently at Cyan. Upon feeling her presence, Cyan felt somewhat disappointed and thought this wasn't good. Brian's eyes began to shine. He started running towards the woman, extended his hands to catch her, clenched his teeth tightly and asked him not to worry because he was going to take her down. Cyan turned around, clenched his fist tightly, and seeing that Brian was ready to attack, he thought this wasn't good. With a confused look, he asked him to wait. Just before he could finish speaking, Brian pounced on the woman, taking her down. Cyan began to look at the woman and, paying a little attention, realized who she was. With a calm look, he asked Brian to stop since they already knew this woman. This woman was none other than Nana, who was disguised as a maid. Brian, who was sitting on top of her, turned his head back and with a confused look asked him if this was true. Nana, who was lying on the ground, closed her eyes and apologized to him since this was her fault. She had small scratches all over her face and was somewhat dizzy. At the same time, somewhere in the palace there was a secret passage, which descended to the bottom of the palace. A man wearing a red hood lit a torch and began to descend down the stairs towards the bottom. Some time later, the man reached the end of the passage. He started moving his torch from side to side to illuminate the room, and it could be seen that there were many men wearing red hoods just like him. He approached them and with a smug smile told his subordinates that it was time to rise. They wore masks to conceal their identity. Upon hearing his order, their eyes began to shine, and they began to smile. While the people were conversing among themselves and enjoying the banquet, Princess Erin began to walk around the area. She was red as a tomato. She crossed her arms and started looking around. She had taken the trouble to invite them but couldn't see them anywhere. She began to get angry but then decided to calm down. She was wearing the necklace that her brother had given her. She put her hand on top of the necklace, sighed, and thought that this was very fickle. At that moment, a girl wearing a blue dress appeared and began to approach her from behind. She grabbed the skirt with both hands, lifted it, and told her that it was an honor for her to meet Princess Erin. Erin started to turn around and with a confused look asked the girl who she was. This person was none other than Luna of Rainreaver. She grabbed the skirt with both hands, lifted it, closed her eyes, bowed her head before her as a sign of respect, and began to smile. Erin did not take long to recognize her as Lunav, a second-year student of the academy. Lunav opened her eyes, started looking at Erin, and upon seeing that she remembered who she was, she began to smile and told her that she was honored. Erin started looking at her with a surprised look and explained that she could never forget the genius of the kingdom of Garam. She welcomed her to the banquet on behalf of the Empire. Lunav put her hands on her abdomen, approached her, and with a pleasant smile thought that Erin was very kind. She just hoped that Cyan would also realize this. Erin simply started looking at Lunav and remained thinking in silence. With a surprised look, she asked her if she also knew Cyan. Lunav stayed calm and responded to her that yes, adding that she had been with him yesterday. Upon hearing this, Erin couldn't help but be in shock and somewhat disappointed. Unintentionally, she asked her if the two of them were close. Realizing that her thoughts had slipped out, she put her hand over her mouth and couldn't help but feel embarrassed. Lunav began to look at her with a confused look and couldn't help but start wondering why she was asking this. She began to stare at her and with a smile told her that as she had thought, Princess Erin, was in love with Cyan. Erin started blushing even more. She brought her hand to her chest and while sweating like crazy, began to question if she really was in love with Cyan. At that moment, a loud noise of someone screaming and asking for help was heard. Erin, who had one hand on her chest, with a confused look started looking towards the direction from where the scream had come and began to wonder what was happening. Lunav started to turn around and with a surprised look began to wonder whose scream it was. Both of them started to look in the direction from where the scream had come, and upon seeing what was happening, they couldn't help but remain in shock. A woman who was present at the banquet panicked, extended her hand towards the others and with a scream and a desperate look asked them to call the guards. But just before she could finish the sentence, one of the hooded men wearing a mask appeared behind her. While his eyes were shining, he launched a precise slash towards the woman, cutting her neck in the process. The man's attack was so powerful that in the blink of an eye, the woman lost her life, causing her headless body to start falling to the ground. Erin went into shock, and due to fear she became paralyzed. With a look full of fear, she thought this was impossible. She didn't know how a monster like him had entered the palace. Lunav started staring at the man and couldn't help but begin to wonder who he was and where he had come from. The woman's blood splattered everywhere, staining the man's clothes. He grabbed the sword with one hand, extended the other to one side, and while his eyes were shining, he began to approach them. Realizing that he was a monster, people panicked and started fleeing the area, wondering where this monster had come from. Several drops of blood fell on the mask that the man was wearing. He began to stare intently at Princess Erin and revealed to them that she was their target. Princess Erin couldn't help but panic. With a look full of fear, she began to wonder who these men were and where they had come from. Lunav, who was standing next to her, started staring intently at the man with a serious look and thought this wasn't good. At the same time, Nana went to one of the rooms in the palace. She grabbed her skirt with both hands, closed her eyes, bowed her head, and with a kind smile introduced herself as Nana, Cyan's maid. In this room was also Emily. She brought her hand to her mouth and couldn't help but be left open-mouthed. Within seconds, she lost balance and fell to her knees on the floor. Nana put one hand on top of the other arm, closed her eyes, and began to smile. Emily fell to her knees before her since she was younger and cuter than her. In the room were also Cyan and Brian. She closed her eyes and started crying like a little girl. While a fountain of tears was falling from her eyes, she asked him if he had left her for Nana. Cyan, who was standing next to her, crossed his arms, closed his eyes, and responded to her that no. Brian, who was next to him, clenched his fist tightly and remained silent. Cyan approached Emily and with a calm look asked her if she was sure that Ashel had brought her here. Emily stopped crying and responded with yes. She closed her eyes, started touching her face with both hands, and explained that Ashel desired her so much that he had even offered her a job. Upon hearing this, Cyan's expression changed drastically. He began staring at her with a murderous look and asked what job she was talking about. Several days ago, Emily went to Ashel's office and he asked her if she wanted to work as his maid this time. Emily, who was standing in front of him, started looking at him with a surprised look and couldn't help but feel somewhat confused since she didn't know what was happening. He approached her and with a smile explained that ever since Cyan had gone to the academy, she seemed quite lonely. After saying this, he asked her if she wanted to be his maid. Back to the present, Emily put a hand under her chin, closed her eyes, and with an arrogant smile explained to him that she had rejected Ashel's offer because she needed to make sure she was there when he returned. Cyan put both hands into his pants pockets, approached her, started looking at the ground, and asked her if she was sure about this. Emily put a hand on top of her head and told him that she was very tired, and seeing how Ashel had brought her here, she supposed that he still hadn't given up. Cyan started to look at the ground and stood still, thinking in silence. Several seconds later, he turned his head to one side and with a serious look told Brian that it was dangerous outside and entrusted him with the mission of protecting Emily and Nana. Brian began to look at Cyan and responded with an understood and with a confused look asked him if he was leaving. With a distant gaze, Cyan replied yes, adding that he had to do it. He remembered that Emily had not been here in his past life. He began to remember how he had caught and tied up Kellen. Since he had found Kellen spying on him, he assumed that he was planning something. While his eyes were filled with rage, he clenched his teeth tightly, making the veins in his face visible. He asked Ashel not to dare touch his people. A while later, Cyan left the room and closed the door. Brian and Emily started looking at the door and remained silent. Then, Emily took out a red bow tie, which had a beautiful red diamond in the center. While she was holding the bow tie, she explained to them that Ashel had told her to give this bow tie to Cyan as a gift. She fell to her knees on the ground again, closed her eyes, and started crying because she had forgotten to give the bow tie to Cyan. She thought she was stupid since she couldn't believe that she had come all this way just to forget it. Brian, who was behind her, clenched both fists tightly and remained silent. Nana, who was in front of her, began sweating and couldn't help but think that she was a very strange person. Nana opened her eyes and with a surprised look, began to smell a strong odor. Emily, who was holding the bow tie with both hands, raised it into the sky, causing it to start emitting an evil energy. Nana's pupils began to revert to dragon form. She started staring intently at the bow tie and thought that this smell was very strange. Several minutes later, night fell and somewhere in the palace, someone wearing gloves placed their hand on the hilt of the sword. This person was Ashel. He turned his head to one side and with a smile told him that it had already begun. The person who was next to him and was smiling was Prince Lionel. He turned his head back, and with a calm and joyful look told him that the day had finally arrived, and that he also knew that Ashel had put in a lot of effort. Ashel approached him and with a smile explained that their gift should have also been delivered. He also added that the man named Boris had been quite useful. Upon hearing this, Lionel couldn't help but start smiling like a madman since they were going to use Boris a lot from now on to change this empire soaked in peace. Ashel began staring intently at Lionel and responded that indeed. While Lionel's eyes were shining, he put his hand over his face and with an evil smile told him it was time to show them who the person the Empire really needed was. At the same time, in the palace where the banquet was taking place, everyone started running. Eren found the exit of the palace. She started pointing towards the exit with her finger, and with a shout asked everyone to evacuate and leave the rest in the hands of the guards. All the people listened to her and started running towards the exit. While everyone was evacuating, Lunev approached the exit, and with a serious look told her that she should evacuate first. Eren, who was standing next to the exit, with a calm look told her that she was fine since they needed to take care of others first. Upon hearing this, Lunev couldn't help but be left open-mouthed. With a surprised look, she decided to help Eren. Eren turned her head towards her and with a cheerful look and smile thanked her. At the same time, inside the palace, the hooded man unsheathed both swords, started running towards the princess, and began to launch a chain of cuts towards them. Several guards appeared and using their swords began to block his attacks, but he was so strong that the bodies of the guards who had blocked the attack were sent flying backward. The black-haired guard started running towards the man and with a look full of determination gave a shout and ordered the others to stop him at all costs. At that moment, he heard a scream coming from behind. He turned his head back, and upon seeing what was happening he couldn't help but be in shock. When he turned around, he saw more hooded men appearing. Behind him were some stairs. A giant man who had a guard's head in his hand appeared. Next to him there were more men. While his eyes were shining, he grabbed the guard's head tightly and with force began to squeeze it, making him open his mouth and start screaming in pain and asking for help. With a bit of strength, the man squeezed the guard's head tightly, crushing it. Witnessing this scene, the black-haired guard was terrified. He couldn't believe that this was happening. This guard was the captain. At that moment, one of the guards caught the captain's attention. Upon hearing the guard's voice, he calmed down again and with a calm look began to turn around. As he turned around, he saw that behind them many demonic trees with sharp teeth had appeared and were massacring the guards like simple ants. The ground was filled with corpses of guards. These trees were known as high-level demonic beasts called mandragoras. The captain did not know why these gigantic demonic beasts, which one normally saw at the front lines, were here. He started to look at the trees and couldn't help but start crying. With a hopeless look he realized that this was unwinnable and that everyone was going to die. The tree opened its mouth which had thousands of teeth and prepared to attack, but at that moment, someone launched an attack towards it. This person was none other than Sarika. Using a bit of mana, she attacked the tree, making a big hole in its mouth, ending its life. While the pieces of the tree were falling to the ground, Sarika landed on the ground. Placing one foot and a knee on it, while her eyes were shining, she began to look towards the ground and remained silent. She turned her head back, and with a serious look gave a shout and ordered the others to use this time to evacuate the people. The captain was left speechless and soon realized that she was one of the instructors from the academy. While he was distracted, another hooded man appeared behind him and prepared to attack. He extended his hand towards the captain and while his body was surrounded by a malevolent energy, he prepared to attack. But for his bad luck, Alice was not going to allow this to happen. She jumped, appeared behind him, started unsheathing her sword and with a piercing look decided it was time to take action. Just before he could attack, Alice used the ability called Quick Blade and launched a powerful slash towards him, cutting his body in half. The captain looked back and upon seeing this, he couldn't help but be shocked. Sarika approached the captain, adopted a defensive stance, clenched both fists tightly causing them to start emitting a powerful green mana. Alice landed near the captain. While with one hand she was holding the sword, she extended the other towards the ground, and with a serious look, asked him to leave this place to them. The captain, who was in shock, started looking at her with a surprised look and responded with an understood. He turned around towards where the other guards were standing, caught their attention and told them that they were going to take care of protecting the people who were evacuating. At that moment, one of the demonic trees began to extend its sharp branches and launched an attack towards them. As the sharp branches were slowly getting closer to them, Sarika and Alice started to stare at it intently and thought it was time to do something about it. They adopted a defensive stance, but the sharp branches changed direction and started heading towards the ceiling. Alice, who was holding the sword, and Sarika turned around and upon seeing that the attack had changed direction, and that they were not the target, they couldn't help but be in shock, and it didn't take long for them to go on alert when they saw that in that direction were the others. In the direction where the sharp branches were advancing was the door through which Eren and Lunev were evacuating people. Eren started looking back and upon seeing that the attack was directed at her, she panicked and thought this wasn't good. With a confused look, Lunev began to wonder what was happening. Sarika didn't take long to realize what was happening. She panicked and with a desperate look caught the attention of Princess Eren, revealing to her that she was the target. At that moment, the sharp branches approached Eren's face. Seeing this, she couldn't help but be paralyzed with fear. But just before the attack could hit her, the captain appeared. He drew his sword. grabbed it with both hands and using all his strength cut the sharp branches in half, saving the princess in the process. He started to look at the ground, clenched his teeth tightly and gave orders to others to protect Princess Erin. Despite the captain having deflected the attack, a small branch passed by her cheek, creating a small cut that caused a bit of blood to come out. Her eyes filled with tears and fear, she did not know what was happening or why she was the target of hooded men. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.